In the previous section, we discussed net present value and internal rate of return, also payback, but we're going to focus now on net present value and the internal rate of return, or the IRR. Those are the two preferred selection criteria. At this point, we know how to calculate NPV, we know how to calculate IRR, but once we've done that, how do we know which projects we ought to select? Well, the rules are fairly straightforward. If a project has a positive NPV, then that's a project that will add value to the firm and we want to take it. Looking at IRR, if the IRR is higher than the required return or cost of capital, then we're going to want to take that project also. Now, these two methods usually yield the same result. You can't have a positive NPV unless the return is higher than the discount rate. And the IRR essentially uses that same discount rate as a hurdle rate and asks the question, is the return higher than this hurdle rate? There's a problem that arises, so let's go back here for one moment. The basic rule is positive NPV greater than 0, take the project, or IRR above the cost of capital, take the project. A problem can arise when we have projects that are mutually exclusive. What do we mean by mutually exclusive? Well, we mean the selection of one alternative will preclude selection of any other alternative. So if we take one project, we can't take the other. In that case, we're going to choose the project that has the higher NPV because it increases the value of the firm the most, or the one that has the higher IRR when those are consistent with one another. When projects are not mutually exclusive, we refer to those as being independent. Two projects are independent, meaning you can make one choice and it doesn't have any impact on the choice that you make for the other project. In that case, we're going to choose every project that has a positive NPV or that has a discount rate, an IRR that's greater than the discount rate. Now, I've noticed students have a problem with this concept of mutually exclusive and independent, so let's make an analogy. Ladies, if you're dating one guy, you're in a mutually exclusive relationship. There's only one guy. On the other hand, if you aren't dating one guy, you're independent, which means you can choose as many guys as meet your selection criteria. So an independent party doesn't date anyone exclusively, but if you're mutually exclusive, you're no longer independent, you're dating only one individual. So that's, I think, an easy way to sort of remember the difference between mutually exclusive and independent. Mutually exclusive, you're dating one guy, you're choosing one project. Independent, you take all the guys that meet your selection criteria, or project-oriented, you take all the projects that meet your selection criteria. So let's consider, we'll step away from dating for a moment. That's all the dating advice that I'm going to give you. Take that for what it's worth. I think my finance advice is much better. Let's consider here a situation where a company is considering building plants in 4 possible cities: Bangkok, Beijing, Mexico City, or Singapore. Now, they only need one plant. So once they build the plant, they're not going to build any other plants. The IRRs for these projects are given, and I think it's pretty clear. There's the IRR. So the Bangkok plant has the highest IRR. The Beijing plant has the second highest. The Mexico City plant the third. And Singapore the lowest, and we also put in here the cost of capital. The cost of capital is 10%. So based upon the selection criteria that we have, that you have to have an IRR above the cost of capital, any of the top 3 would be suitable. But because these are mutually exclusive projects, we can't take all the projects. We're going to want to take the project that has the best IRR, which is going to be Bangkok. If we look at the net present value criteria, okay, we're going to come to the same conclusion. We've rank ordered the projects based upon net present value. The Bangkok has a 300,000, we'll say that's thousands, $300,000 net present value, and Beijing has 200,000. So if we couldn't take the Bangkok plant for some reason, we couldn't get zoning, say, the Beijing plant would be worth taking, but because it would add $200,000 in value to our firm. But we'd rather take something that adds $300,000. So if we can take the Bangkok project, that's the one we're going to choose. It's the preferred choice under a mutually exclusive situation. Now, it's also possible that, well, let's change the facts a little bit. Let's imagine that we're looking not at 4 mutually exclusive plants, but we're looking at 4 independent alternatives where we could choose. Let's say we're McDonald's and we're considering building restaurants. If we build a restaurant in Bangkok, that doesn't preclude us from building one in Beijing, in Mexico City, or in Singapore. We can build them all if we want to. And the question is, do we want to? Well, the answer would be we're going to choose every project that meets our selection criteria. For the IRR, the selection criteria is we want to take projects that exceed the cost of capital. Right? It's costing us 10% to obtain money. We want to invest in projects that will earn us more than what it costs us to get the money. So we're going to take all 3 of those projects. Singapore, let's scratch that one out. It doesn't earn enough. It only earns 9%, and we require 10% before we're willing to take a project. So it doesn't meet the discount rate or the required return. Discount rate is the term we're using for net present value, required return for the IRR. If we look at the net present value under independent projects, we take all projects NPV greater than 0. What are they? All 3 of those. The Singapore project, we don't want that one. Doesn't earn enough. It has a negative net present value. So it's not earning a return in excess of the discount rate. Let's consider for a moment, going back to the previous section, we had 2 projects, investment A and investment B, and we had a cost of capital we had assumed of 10%. Which ones will we choose under mutually exclusive and independent criteria? Well, recall these are the internal rates of return for investment A and investment B. This was the net present value for each of those. And one thing we see here is that the cost of capital was 10%. Both of these earn the cost of capital in excess of the cost of capital. If we're not using mutually exclusive, if we have independent projects, so this is not mutually exclusive, means they're independent. Just put a little independent there. We can accept both of them because they both earn in excess of 10%. Likewise, you'll notice that they both have a positive net present value, and so under the net present value criteria, we would accept both of them. If, on the other hand, we can only take one, right, they're mutually exclusive, we can only date one, we can only take one project, we're going to take the better of the 2. The better of the 2 is the one that earns the higher internal rate of return, which is project B is higher than project A, and also it has the higher net present value. And so under either criteria, we're going to choose we're going to choose investment B. Now, in the example we just looked at, the IRR and the NPV for mutually exclusive projects yielded exactly the same result. We chose Bangkok under either criteria. We chose investment B under either criteria. In general, the IRR and the NPV method call for the same decision when we're looking at mutually exclusive projects. When we're looking at independent projects, any project that's accepted under NPV is going to also have an IRR that exceeds the discount rate or the required rate of return. So for independent projects, they'll always give us a go or a no-go that's consistent with one another. For mutually exclusive projects, sometimes they don't. All right, why? Well, when the timing of cash flows is uneven, so we don't get the same cash flow every year, then sometimes the reinvestment assumption becomes important. And by the reinvestment assumption, what we're talking about is if we get $1 of cash flows from a project, what are we going to do with that $1? What are we assuming is going to take place? For the IRR, the assumption that we make is, and it's implicit, but the assumption is that any cash flow that we get can be reinvested in another project that will yield the IRR. In other words, we'll be able to find another project that's just as good as this project that we're considering right now, the IRR project. And in general, that's not an assumption that leads to problems, but it could be unrealistic when we have a project that has an unusually high IRR. And so for mutually exclusive projects, that's going to be, that investment assumption is going to become most unrealistic exactly for the one that we're most likely to choose under the criteria that we use for choosing between mutually exclusive projects with IRR. We're going to choose the one with the highest IRR, and it's the one that's going to be making the assumption that we can reinvest at the IRR. The NPV makes a different assumption. In the net present value assumption, the implicit assumption is that any inflows we get can be reinvested at the discount rate. Okay, so in our previous two examples, we had a 10% discount rate, and the NPV assumption is any cash flows we get can be reinvested at 10%. So let's consider why that assumption might be a problem. Let's go back to the slide where we had down at the bottom investment A and investment B that we're choosing between these two investments. Under the IRR assumption, the investment A, any money we get from investment A, we'll be able to find another project that will return 11.17%. And investment B will find a project, we can find a project later on that will return 14.33%. Now think about this. We're going to get a dollar of cash from investment A, or we could get a dollar of cash from investment B. What this suggests is a dollar of cash, a dollar that comes out of investment B is worth more than a dollar that comes out of investment A. Okay? Quick analogy. You go to the vending machine and you've got a quarter in your right pocket and a quarter in your left pocket, and you pull out a quarter from your right pocket. Is that quarter worth any more than the quarter that's in your left pocket? It doesn't matter where the quarter is coming from. Once you've got it, it should be worth the same thing. Now, under the NPV assumption, we're going to assume every quarter we get, we can go earn 10% on, regardless of which pocket, this pocket or this pocket, regardless of which pocket it came out of, we can only earn 10%. Right? It's clearly a better assumption that a dollar that comes out of any pocket is going to be worth the same thing once you've collected it. Once you've got the money out of the pocket, it's worth the same thing. Once you get a dollar of cash flow out of an investment, it should be worth the same thing. The IRR assumption is that it's not. The implicit assumption is that the dollar that comes out of the higher yielding project, you'll be able to reinvest at a better rate than you could a dollar that came out of a lower yielding project. So that's clearly unrealistic, and for that reason, the NPV criteria, when we're looking at mutually exclusive projects, the NPV criteria is the better criteria. Occasionally, and we'll see some examples of this in problems, the NPV rank ordering will be different from the IRR rank ordering, in which case you should take the NPV rank ordering. It's the better alternative.